In a town where folks believed every Apache was a killer, two 10-year-old twin sisters stumbled across one bleeding out in the dust. They knew bringing him home could mark their family for death, yet they couldn't walk away. From the moment they laid him on their cabin floor, the Thompsons' quiet life was gone, replaced by a fight that would change everything. Don't forget to like, drop a comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned because the next chapter is one you won't want to miss. They say the Apaches slit a rancher's throat last week, and the sheriff reckons there'll be more blood if we don't smoke 'em out. The man's voice cut through the heat of the Red Mesa store loud enough for every ear inside to hear. Margaret Thompson froze where she stood by the flour sacks, her hand tightening on the basket handle. Another voice joined in, rough and mean. Heard they burned a wagon, too. Devil folk, all of 'em. Sheriff Ward says they got camps up by the river. Won't be long before they come down on the town. The words drew nods and dark mutters. Fear had a way of turning into anger quick in Red Mesa, especially with the sheriff feeding it. Men leaned on the counter, spurs jangling, their faces set hard. Someone spat on the floorboards and muttered, "A good Apache's a dead Apache." Margaret kept her eyes low. She'd learned that arguing only painted a target on your back. With the basket tight in her grip, she slipped outside into the blinding sunlight. The desert stretched out wide and merciless, the red cliffs looming like silent judges. At the fence near the road, Clara and Lily waited, brushing dust off their dresses while Bruno wagged his tail. Clara noticed the strain in her mama's face before she even reached them. Ma Clara asked, her voice steady, though her eyes sharp. "They talkin' bad again?" Margaret didn't answer right away, just took their hands and started down the dusty track toward home. "Folks round here believe what the sheriff tells them," she said at last. "And Sheriff Ward, well, he don't mind stirring a fire so long as he ain't the one burned by it." Lily's face fell, her soft features shadowed by worry. "But Ma, we never even seen an Apache." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "Don't matter, child. Fear don't need truth. It just needs a voice loud enough to spread it." The cabin came into sight at the edge of the mesa, a crooked thing patched with scrap tin, but it was home. Bruno bounded ahead, barking at a lizard skittering across the stones, his joy a reminder that not everything was dark. Inside, they settled to their small comforts. Clara and Lily helped with supper, stirring beans into the pot while their mother cut the bread she'd baked that morning. Laughter rose when Bruno nudged his nose under the table, begging like a child himself. For a while, the outside world with its anger and suspicion stayed beyond their door. After supper, Margaret pulled the worn Bible from the shelf. They read together, the girls leaning against her shoulders as the firelight painted their faces. When the reading was done, Clara whispered, "Ma, do you think Pa's listening?" Margaret smiled, though her heart still ached at the memory of her husband. "He's listening, darling. He wouldn't leave us for good." The girls fell asleep under thin quilts. Bruno sprawled at their feet, his ears twitching even in rest. But Margaret lingered by the fire, her mind restless. Outside, the desert lay quiet under the stars. Yet in the distance, faint as a warning, came the sound of hooves. She whispered to the flames, "Lord, keep us safe in this land that don't know mercy." The fire cracked low, and the mesas outside stood in silence, holding secrets too heavy for the night. The morning came too soon, the desert sun rising sharp and unkind, painting the cliffs of Red Mesa in hard red light. Margaret had barely slept, her mind circling the echo of hooves she'd heard the night before. She moved slow about the cabin, stirring the embers back to life, setting water to heat. Clara and Lily still slept curled close together under their thin quilts. Bruno sprawled across the bed's foot like a faithful guard. When the girls finally woke, the air already carried the dry heat of summer. Margaret kissed their foreheads, brushing back loose strands of hair. "Stay close today," she said, her voice carrying more weight than usual. "Ain't the time for wandering?" They nodded, but as children will, the warning settled soft instead of heavy. After chores with Bruno tugging at their heels, they slipped toward the canyon's edge where the wild berries grew baskets in hand. The trail cut narrow between rocks and scrub, the silence broken only by the scrape of their boots and Bruno's occasional snort. Lily plucked a berry, rolling it between her fingers. "Ma's been worried more lately," she said, her tone quiet. Clara glanced back, scanning the trail behind them as if expecting trouble. "She hears things in town. You know how folks talk. Ma says Sheriff Ward's stirring up fear about Apaches." Lily hesitated, then whispered, "Maybe they are dangerous. Folks wouldn't say it if it wasn't true." Clara's jaw tightened. She remembered the words she'd overheard in the store the day before, men saying a good Apache was a dead one. She didn't like the way it had sounded, mean and proud of itself. Pa always said you can't judge a man by what folks claim. He said, "Look with your own eyes first." Before Lily could answer, Bruno stopped dead, ears pricked, a low growl rising deep in his throat. The girls froze. Bruno darted off the trail, barking short and sharp. Bruno, Clara called, rushing after him with Lily close behind. The brush thinned near a rocky outcrop, and there he was. A man lay sprawled on the ground, half hidden by scrub and shadow. His shirt was torn dark with blood, his chest rising shallow, ragged. His face, framed by long black hair, was strong even in weakness, the lines of his jaw and brow sharp as the cliffs themselves. Lily gasped, dropping her basket so the berries rolled across the dirt. "Clara, he's an Apache." The word came out heavy, the way it had been said in town, a warning, a curse. Clara knelt beside him, her fingers trembling as she touched his shoulder. The heat of fever burned through his skin. "He's alive," she whispered. "Barely." Lily hovered fear in her eyes. "We can't, Clara. If Ma finds out, if folks find out." Clara pulled off her scarf, pressing it firm against the wound in his chest. The man flinched, a weak groan escaping his lips. Bruno circled, growling at the brush, but not at the man, as if he understood the difference. "Help me, Lily," Clara said, her voice sharp now. Lily shook her head, tears pooling. "You heard what they said in town. Apaches kill ranchers, burn wagons. What if he's dying?" Clara cut in, her eyes fierce. "Pa told us never leave a man to die, no matter who he is. You remember?" Lily bit her lip, torn. "What if Pa was wrong?" Clara pressed harder on the wound, blood soaking through the scarf. "Then I'll be wrong with him. But I ain't letting him die here like a dog. Are you with me or not?" For a long breath, Lily's fear held her still. Then she knelt, her small hands pressing over Clara's to hold the scarf in place. "All right," she whispered. "All right." Together they lifted their arms, straining under his weight. He was heavier than either expected, but fear and stubborn will lent them strength. Bruno stayed close, growling whenever a branch snapped in the distance. Step by step, with pauses for breath, they dragged and half-carried the man toward home. By the time they reached the cabin, sweat ran down their faces, their dresses stained with dirt and blood. Bruno pushed the door open with his nose, and they stumbled inside, lowering the man onto the wooden floor. Margaret turned from the hearth at the sound, her face pale as she saw the blood trailing in with them. "Lord Almighty!" she cried, rushing forward, her hands flying to her mouth. "What have you done?" The girls started talking at once, words tumbling over each other in a rush of panic. "He was lying out there. We couldn't leave him. Ma, he's bleeding so bad. Pa said Pa told us never." Margaret's hands shook as she tried to make sense of it, her heart pounding so loud it drowned their voices. "Stop! Both of you! Stop!" Her breath came quick, her eyes darting between the stranger's bloodied chest and her daughter's desperate faces. Clara stepped forward, her chin trembling but set, firm tears shining in her eyes. "We couldn't leave him, Ma. Pa always said a man's life is worth saving no matter who he is." Lily clutched her sister's arm, her own voice trembling. "He'd have died, Ma. Right there in the dirt." Margaret stared down at the man, his skin slick with sweat, his breath shallow. Everything in her screamed danger. Folks would hang her if they knew she'd brought an Apache into her home. But behind that fear was her daughter's faces so full of belief of the lessons their father had left behind. She dropped to her knees beside him, her skirts pooling in the blood. "Lord, help me," she muttered, pressing her hands over Clara's scarf. "Your pa's lessons are going to be the death of me, I swear." She shot a glance at the rafters, her voice low but sharp. "You hear me, John Thompson? If your fool lessons get us killed, I'll hunt you down in heaven and give you a piece of my mind." Her hands moved quick despite the quaking in them, tearing strips from an old sheet, pressing them firm to the wound. She barked orders through her fear. "Clara, fetch more water. Lily, the clean rags from the trunk. Hurry now." The girls scrambled, eager to help, their small bodies moving with purpose. Margaret worked to bind the bleeding, muttering curses at her late husband, even as her heart prayed the stranger would hold on. When at last the bleeding slowed, she sat back on her heels, her chest heaving. The man's eyes flickered open for a moment, dark and clouded, and she thought she saw a flicker of gratitude before they closed again. Lily whispered, "Ma, will he live?" Margaret sighed. "If he's meant to, he will. That's in the Lord's hands now." Lily bit her lip, eyes darting to the door. "What if Sheriff Ward finds out?" He said. "Don't you finish that." Margaret cut in, her tone firm. "You let Ward say what he pleases. We don't answer to him." She hesitated, then added quieter, "But we don't breathe a word of this to anyone you hear. Not a soul." Both girls nodded, wide-eyed. Bruno huffed as if in agreement. Margaret knelt beside the bed they'd fashioned from blankets on the floor, brushing damp hair from the man's brow. She studied him, the strong lines of his face, the scars along his arms. He wasn't some wild tale spun in town. He was flesh and bone, hurt and near broken, and she wondered what story lay behind the bullet hole in his chest. Later, while the man slept fitful, the girls sat on the porch steps with Bruno. The sun dipped the sky, turning orange and violet. Lily leaned against Clara, her voice soft. "You think Ma's angry with us?" Clara kept her eyes on the horizon. "She's scared. I can see it. But she ain't angry. Pa would have done the same." "But what if Pa was wrong, Clara? What if folks in town are right?" Clara shook her head firm. "Pa said doin' right don't always mean doin' safe. I'd rather be wrong with him than right with folks like Ward." Inside, Margaret listened from the shadow of the doorway. Their words cut deep, filling her chest with both pride and dread. She wanted to scold them, to tell them right now the world didn't allow for such bravery. But another part of her, the part that still dreamed of John's laugh and the way he used to hum after long days, knew the girls were carrying his spirit. She muttered under her breath, "John Thompson, you fool man, you've gone and planted your stubborn heart in them, and now it's my job to keep it from getting us all killed." The night fell heavy. Margaret kept the lantern low, watching the man's shallow breathing. Once his eyes fluttered open, dark and clouded. He whispered something, a word she didn't know, before slipping back under. Margaret sat still, listening to the crickets outside, the distant howl of a coyote, Bruno's low growl now and then. Every sound felt sharper, closer. At one point, she caught herself staring at the rifle propped by the door. It hadn't fired in years, but it was all they had. She whispered a prayer, asking for strength, asking for wisdom, asking not to regret the choice she'd made that morning. Toward dawn, when the sky just began to pale, Clara woke and crept to her mother's side. She laid a hand on Margaret's arm. "You should rest, Ma." Margaret shook her head. "Later. He needs watchin'." Clara looked down at the man, then back at her mother. "I don't think Bruno would have let us bring him if he was bad." Margaret studied her daughter's serious face. "Maybe so. Dogs know things we don't." Lily stirred, then rubbing her eyes, crawling to sit with them. She took her mother's hand, small and warm. "Ma, you think Pa'd be proud of us?" Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tight. She pulled them both close, kissing their hair. "He'd be proud. He'd also be calling me a fool for letting you two out on your own." She gave a shaky laugh, though her eyes stung. "I swear if I see that man again in heaven, I'll give him what for." They sat together, the three of them, huddled in the quiet, Bruno watching the door like a sentinel. Outside, the mesas glowed faint with the first touch of sunlight, as though holding their breath along with the Thompsons. By full daylight, the man stirred again. His eyes opened wider this time, unfocused but alert. He tried to push himself up, but the effort drew a groan. Margaret pressed him back gently. "Stay still. You're hurt bad." He blinked his gaze, moving from her face to the two girls peeking over her shoulder, then to Bruno's watchful eyes. His lips moved dry and cracked. Margaret fetched a cup of water, holding it to his mouth. He drank slow, then whispered, "Tahu." Margaret frowned. "That your name?" He gave the smallest nod. Clara leaned close, curiosity bright in her eyes. "Tahu," she repeated softly as though testing the sound. Margaret shot her a look. "Back, Clara. Give him room." But Tahu's lips twitched the ghost of a smile before his eyes slid shut again. Margaret pulled the blanket higher over his chest, her thoughts racing. She turned to her girls. "Remember what I said. Not a word to anyone. We keep him quiet, we keep him hidden, and we pray no one comes sniffing around." The cabin settled into a strange rhythm in the days after the girls had carried the Apache home. Margaret kept him hidden in the small storage room off the kitchen, the only space with a door they could close. The smell of dried herbs and old wood filled the air there, and she laid him on a cot fashioned from an old frame her John had built years ago. She changed his bandages with water she boiled every morning, muttering prayers as she worked her hands steady, though her mind was anything but. Clara fetched clean cloths, careful as a grown woman, while Lily stayed close with the lamp, watching his face, as if studying every breath. Bruno lay across the doorway, most hours rising only to bark when the wind rattled the shutters, or a horse trotted past out on the road. By the third day, color had started to return to the Apache's face. His eyes opened more often, dark and sharp now, though his body was still weak. He spoke little, his words quiet sometimes in a tongue the girls didn't know. But when Margaret offered him water, he always nodded thanks, and that small courtesy eased her worry some. One afternoon, Clara found herself watching as he motioned for a stick of wood from the pile by the hearth. She brought it uncertain, and he set to shaving it with a small knife Margaret had allowed him. His movements were slow but sure, each cut clean. Lily sat beside him wide-eyed, whispering questions Clara couldn't believe she was bold enough to ask. He didn't answer them all, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of mountains. He told them of the high country where the pine trees grew tall and the air smelled sweet after rain, of rivers cold enough to sting the skin of nights when the stars stretched wider than any map could hold. Clara listened, her mind painting pictures she'd never seen, and for the first time she wondered if the tales told in town had been wrong all along. It was on the 5th morning when trouble near found them. The girls had been in the yard helping their ma hang the wash while Bruno trotted between them chasing shadows. The sun was already hot, pressing down like a weight, when the sound of boots crunching on the path came sudden. Morning, a woman's voice called sharp and familiar. Margaret stiffened. It was Mrs. Carter, their nearest neighbor, a widow like herself, but less kind, more prone to wagging her tongue in town. Before Margaret could answer, the woman had stepped into the yard, her bonnet tipped back, eyes squinting. "Brought over some of that lye soap I promised," she said, holding out a wrapped bar. Her gaze roamed past Margaret toward the cabin door. "Much obliged," Margaret said quickly, forcing a smile, though her heart began to pound. "You didn't have to." Mrs. Carter shrugged, then frowned as Bruno suddenly bounded for the door, barking low. The woman's eyes followed, and before Margaret could stop her, she stepped past the wash line and peered through the open doorway. What she saw made her hand fly to her chest. Tahu sat just inside his back, propped against the cot, showing Clara how to carve a small piece of wood into the shape of a bird. Lily sat cross-legged, watching in awe, her small hands clutching the curls of shavings. The knife glinted in his hand, harmless in his slow work, but the sight was enough. Mrs. Carter let out a sharp cry. "Dear God, Margaret," she gasped, stumbling back. "You've got an Apache in your house." The girls jumped to their feet, faces pale, their hearts in their throats. Clara dropped the piece of wood. Lily clutched Bruno's fur like a lifeline. They knew what this meant if Mrs. Carter told the town their ma could be dragged out by Ward's men before the day was through. Ma Clara cried, rushing out. She saw Margaret moved fast, her skirts catching on the wash line as she hurried forward. She caught Mrs. Carter by the arm before the woman could turn down the path. "Wait, please." The neighbor's eyes were wild. "You've lost your senses, Margaret. That man'll cut your throats in your sleep," Ward said. "Ward says a lot of things." Margaret snapped, her grip tightening. "Look at him. Does he look like a monster to you?" Mrs. Carter hesitated, glancing back toward the doorway where Tahu still sat, his face calm though pale, his hands folded now over the carving. The girls stood close to him, not afraid, and Bruno lay at his feet, tail thumping once against the floorboards. "I don't care how he looks," Mrs. Carter said, her voice shaking. "They're killers, Margaret. Every one of them. I won't be part of this madness." Margaret's eyes filled, her voice dropping to a plea. "He's hurt. He'd have died out there if my girls hadn't found him. They couldn't walk away, and neither could I. You know, John, he raised them to help no matter who it was. I can't teach them now to turn their backs." Mrs. Carter's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at the twins, their small faces tight with fear, and for the first time she seemed unsure. "You'll bring Ward's men down on us all," she whispered. "Then let me be the fool that pays the price." Margaret answered, her voice steady now, though her hands trembled. "But please don't speak of this. Not to Ward. Not to anyone. I'm begging you." Silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the wash line in the hot wind. Mrs. Carter studied her, then let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging. "You're mad as a hatter," she muttered. "But I'll hold my tongue. For the girls' sake, not for yours." Margaret's knees nearly gave with relief. She squeezed the woman's hand. "Thank you. I won't forget it." Mrs. Carter shook her off, her eyes still sharp. "Don't thank me yet. If Ward catches wind, there'll be no stopping him. And I won't risk my own neck if it comes to that." With that, she turned and strode down the path, her bonnet bobbing against the glare of the sun. Margaret stood frozen until she was gone from sight. Then she turned, her breath unsteady, to find the girls staring at her from the doorway. "Ma," Lily whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "She's gonna tell." Margaret pulled them close, her arms tight around their thin shoulders. "No," she said softly, though she prayed her words were true. "She won't." Clara clutched at her sleeve. But what if Margaret shook her head? "No more what ifs. We've made our choice. Now we see it through." That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Margaret sat by the dying fire, her face lit by the embers. She thought of John, of the lessons he'd left their daughters, and she whispered bitterly, "If this lands us all in the ground, I'll march right up to heaven and tan your hide, John Thompson." From the room beyond, Tahu's low voice rose, speaking words she didn't understand, soft and steady like a prayer. She listened, her chest easing just enough for her to close her eyes and breathe. Out in town, Ezekiel Ward was already hearing tales of blood near the canyon, his men restless, their eyes sharp for signs. The hunt was tightening, and Red Mesa was holding its breath. The wind had shifted by nightfall, hot during the day, but now carrying a dampness that spoke of rain. Margaret could feel it in her bones as she laid the last log on the fire. The girls were seated at the rough table bowls of rabbit stew before them, their faces lit by the flicker of the lantern. Bruno lay stretched out near the hearth, his ears twitching at every snap of the flames. Tahu rested in the storage room, propped against pillows, his color better, though his body still too weak for much more than breathing steady. They had just bowed their heads for grace when the sound came. Hooves, dozens of them pounding in the distance, closing in fast. Margaret's spoon slipped against the bowl, her stomach dropping. Bruno's head shot up, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The girls froze, their eyes wide, their hands gripping each other across the table. Margaret stood slowly, her heart thudding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She crossed the room in 3 steps and lifted her late husband's rifle from its place by the door. The metal was dull, The wood worn smooth, and she knew the firing pin hadn't been right in years, but it was all they had. The hoofbeats grew louder, circling. Shadows passed by the windows. Then a sharp knock rattled the door. "Open up, Margaret Thompson." The voice was loud, rough, and sure of itself. "We know you're harboring one of 'em devils. Hand him over now and maybe we let you be." Lily let out a small cry, clutching Clara's arm. Bruno barked once, fierce and sharp, his teeth bared. Margaret's hands shook as she leveled the rifle at the door. "Go back where you came from," she called, her voice louder than she felt. "There's nothing here for you." A harsh laugh came in reply. "You think we don't know woman tracks led right here? Don't play me for a fool. Hand over the Apache or we tear that place apart and drag him out ourselves." Clara stood her knees knocking, but her chin lifted. "Ma," she whispered. "They'll break in." From the storage room came the sound of movement. Tahu, pale and unsteady, had forced himself upright. He leaned on the doorframe, a long knife in his hand, his breath ragged. His eyes met Margaret's, calm but fierce, as if to say he would not go down without a fight. Margaret swallowed her grip, tightening on the rifle. She stepped in front of her daughters, her voice steady, though her insides quaked. "This is my home. You set one boot inside and I swear I'll fire." The answer came not in words, but in the splintering crack of wood. The door shuddered under a heavy kick. Margaret braced her shoulder against it, gritting her teeth. Another kick followed harder, and the frame groaned. The girls huddled behind her, clutching Bruno's fur as he snarled, ready to spring. Margaret's mind raced. She could not hold them off. She whispered quick, desperate words. "Lord, give me strength." The third kick splintered the latch. The door burst open, and the men poured in, faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, guns glinting in the lamplight. At their front stood Ezekiel Ward, tall, broad, with a cruel grin that made Margaret's blood run cold. "There he is." Ward spat his eyes, landing on Tahu. "Told you she'd be fool enough." Margaret raised the rifle. "One more step, Ezekiel, and I'll put you down." Ward sneered. "That rusted stick, you'll be lucky if it fires at all." He motioned to his men. "Take him." They surged forward. Bruno lunged, teeth sinking into the arm of the first man through. The man howled, stumbling back. Margaret pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the small cabin. Smoke filled the air. When it cleared, the man she'd aimed at was still standing, the shot gone wide. Ward laughed, stepping inside. "Pathetic." "Stand down, woman!" The girls screamed as the men pressed forward. Tahu staggered, knife raised, but his body swayed with weakness. The fight seemed hopeless, the cabin too small, the enemy too many. And then it came. A sound from outside, rising sharp and long, cutting through the roar of the storm. A high, piercing call that sent a shiver through the night. Another answered, and then another echoing off the cliffs. The men froze, their faces paling. From the darkness beyond the cabin walls, voices rose in unison, strong and wild. The sound of hooves thundered closer. Not Ward's men this time, but something else, something fierce. Ward spun toward the door, his grin faltering. "No," he muttered. The next instant, arrows sliced through the open window, thudding into the walls. A shot rang from outside, and one of Ward's men cried out, dropping his pistol. Apache's, another shouted panic in his voice. The cabin erupted in chaos. Ward cursed, shoving his way back out the door. His men followed, firing wildly into the dark. Bruno barked and lunged, driving them faster. Margaret pulled her girls tight against her, shielding them as the night filled with the sounds of battle. Tahu straightened, gripping his knife, though his body trembled. His eyes burned with a fire that fear could not quench. He looked to Margaret and nodded once, as if to say, "It is time." Outside, the Apache warriors swept in like shadows, their horses surging through the storm boughs and rifles flashing in the lightning. Their war cries split the air, fierce and unrelenting. Ward stumbled into the yard, firing blindly, but the Apaches were quicker. One arrow struck the hat from his head, another the rifle from his hand. He turned, trying to mount his horse, but Bruno was faster. The dog barreled into him, teeth snapping at his arm. Ward screamed, tumbling into the mud, scrambling free only to flee on foot, leaving his weapon behind. Clara and Lily clung to each other at the doorway, watching with wide eyes as the yard filled with smoke and shouts. The Apaches drove Ward's men back, their silhouettes flashing in the stormlight. Tahu staggered out into the yard, his brothers rushing to meet him, their hands steadying him. Even wounded, he stood tall, his voice joining theirs in a cry that shook the night. The battle raged brief but fierce. Gunfire cracked, arrows flew, men cursed and fell. And then, as sudden as it had begun, it was over. Ward's men scattered into the dark, leaving behind weapons, boots, and pride. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the patter of rain on the cabin roof, and Bruno's low growl as he returned to the porch, his muzzle wet with blood. Tahu limped forward, his hand gripping the shoulder of a fellow warrior. He crossed to the doorway where Clara and Lily stood, trembling, their faces pale but unbroken. He laid a blood-stained hand gently on Clara's shoulder, then on Lily's. His voice, though hoarse, was steady. "Sisters," he said. "Little sisters of the Apache." The girls' eyes filled with tears, their fear melting into something stronger, something that felt like pride. Margaret stepped behind them, her hand resting on their backs, her face weary but fierce. She met Tahu's gaze, and for the first time she saw not danger, but family. From that night on, the Thompsons would not stand alone. The months passed, and with them the sharp edges of fear dulled, though the memory of that stormy night never left the Thompson cabin. The land around Red Mesa had begun to soften into fall, the days still hot, but the evenings cooler, the kind of cool that made a body glad for the smell of wood smoke drifting from a chimney. The town had its whispers, as it always did. Ezekiel Ward had left after that night, nursing wounds to his pride more than his flesh, and though he had promised to return, he hadn't. His men scattered to other towns, some too ashamed to speak of how they'd been driven back by those they'd called savages. Folks still muttered about Apaches in the hills, but for now the threat had faded. Margaret had opened the shutters wide again, letting sunlight spill across the wooden counter where she set out loaves of bread and jars of preserves. The bakery stall, the same one John had dreamed of before he passed, stood once more in the corner of the town's small market. She sold her bread and pies with a smile, though her eyes stayed cautious, always watching. What the townfolk didn't know was that many of the ingredients she used had been carried under cover of night to her back door. Bundles of corn, sacks of beans, jars of wild honey, and herbs that cured coughs and fever, all left without a word by those she now thought of as unseen friends. The girls had found them more than once, set neatly against the wall as though placed by careful hands. Margaret never asked how they were delivered. She only whispered thanks when she found them, knowing who she owed them to. Clara and Lily had grown quieter, in some ways more thoughtful. They still played with Bruno in the yard and helped their ma with chores, but they carried themselves different, like children who had seen more than they were meant to. Some nights Clara woke with the sound of hoofbeats in her ears, her hand reaching for her sister in the dark. Lily dreamed of shouting voices and rain beating the roof, but in her dreams, Tahu always appeared steady and strong, and the fear faded. Tahu came when he could never, staying long, never drawing attention. Sometimes he brought a rabbit slung over his shoulder, sometimes nothing but stories. He taught Clara how to follow the lines of a deer's track in the sand, to read where the hoof had slipped, or where the animal had paused to drink. He showed Lily how to listen for the difference in the wind when it carried the scent of rain or of strangers. The girls listened with wide eyes, soaking up every word. When Margaret worried that they were becoming too tied to him, Tahu only said softly, "They must know the land if they are to live with it." One afternoon he taught Lily a song in his tongue, the words slow and gentle. She sang it in the yard while she and Clara shelled beans, her voice rising with the breeze. Margaret heard it and felt her throat tighten, not because she feared it, but because it sounded like hope in a place that had known so much fear. Bruno adored Tahu, his tail thumping whenever the man appeared. Margaret once joked, "If that dog could talk, he'd tell me you were kin." Tahu only smiled, the lines of his face easing for a moment. The town remained uneasy. Sheriff Ward was gone, but other men kept watchful eyes on the mesas. Stories of raided camps and missing cattle still made their rounds, though no one ever proved the Apache's hand in it. Margaret kept her head down, focused on her stall, her daughters, and the small circle of trust she'd chosen. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the cliffs red, Margaret sat outside the cabin with her mending. Clara and Lily knelt in the dirt nearby, tracing shapes in the sand with sticks. Bruno lay between them, his chin resting on his paws, his ears flicking now and then. "Do you think they'll come again, Ma?" Lily asked softly, her stick dragging a crooked line. Margaret set down her sewing and looked out at the mesas glowing under the dying sun. "They might. Men like Ward don't give up easy. But we'll be ready." Clara lifted her chin. "We've got Tahu now, and his people." Margaret smiled faintly, though her heart tightened. "We've got ourselves, too. Don't forget that." As if summoned by their words, a figure appeared along the ridge, his silhouette clear against the sky. Bruno's tail thumped, and the girls scrambled to their feet, waving. Tahu descended the slope, slow, steady, until he reached the yard. He greeted them with a nod, his eyes warm, though his face stayed serious. He carried no weapon this time, only a small pouch slung across his shoulder. "I brought medicine," he said simply, handing it to Margaret. Inside were leaves and roots. She recognized remedies for fever and pain. "Thank you," she replied, her voice quiet but sure. That evening, as the fire crackled and shadows deepened, Tahu told them of his people's mountains, of a canyon where the river carved deep into the earth, and of a hawk that returned each spring to the same nest, no matter how fierce the storms. The girls listened, leaning close, their faces lit by firelight. Margaret watched them, her heart swelling with both pride and worry. She knew they were changing their world, growing bigger than the cabin walls, and though it scared her, it also made her proud. When Tahu rose to leave, Clara touched his arm. "Will you come back soon?" He looked at her, then at Lily, and his lips curved just enough to show the ghost of a smile. "When I can." He slipped into the night silent as the wind and Bruno watched until the darkness swallowed him. Weeks later, as autumn deepened, the market bustled with more life than it had in years. Margaret's stall stood bright with loaves of bread, jars of preserves, and small pies Clara had helped shape. Townfolk bought from her readily, their words kinder now, though she knew whispers still stirred behind their backs. She didn't care. Her girls were fed, her home was standing, and she had friends she could not name, but trusted more than most. That evening, Clara and Lily sat with Bruno in the yard as the sun bled across the mesas, turning the sky into fire. They leaned against each other, their eyes on the horizon where the cliffs met the sky. Lily's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Clara, we saved him that day, but I think maybe he saved us more." Clara squeezed her hand, her eyes shining in the fading light. Pa would have said the same. Bruno wagged his tail, pressing close, and from the cliffs came a long, distant call, the sound of an Apache war cry, not fierce this time, but steady, like a promise carried on the wind. The girls looked up, their faces calm, and Margaret, watching from the doorway, felt the weight of fear ease just enough for her to smile. The mesas stood tall in the dying sun, keeping their secrets. But for the Thompsons, the promise was clear. They were not alone. Not anymore. You know friends after walking with Clara. Lily, Margaret, and Tahu through this story. I can't help but sit back and think about what it really says to us. This isn't just a Western tale about horses, rifles, and dusty mesas. It's about the choices we make when fear is screaming in our ears and the world tells us to turn our backs. Margaret and her girls had every reason to slam that door on Tahu, to protect themselves, to follow the crowd, and believe the whispers. But they didn't. They listened to their hearts, And maybe to the voice of John Thompson still echoing in their memories, reminding them that helping someone in need is never the wrong thing to do. And that one act of courage, just two little girls refusing to walk away, ended up saving their whole family. It's a powerful reminder that kindness and bravery can change everything, even when it seems hopeless. We all live in a world that sometimes tells us to be afraid of each other, to judge before we understand. But maybe, just maybe, if we stop and see the human being in front of us, we'll find the courage to do what's right instead of what's easy. So here's my question for you. If you were in Clara and Lily's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to help knowing the danger? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if this story touched you the way it did me, don't forget to share it with someone who could use a little reminder of hope and humanity today.